Hi, this is Dakota Livesay, publisher of the 1800s newspaper Chronicle of the Old West and host of the syndicated radio show of the same name. According to Western novels and movies, gunfights were a common occurrence. They portray two steely-eyed men, one wearing a white hat and the other black, walking toward each other at high noon or sunrise on an empty street. Their holsters are slung low on their hip and tied to their leg. As they get to within 40 yards of each other, the man in the white hat indicates that, in the name of justice and fairness, he will not draw first. Then, in a flash, pistols are drawn. Each man fires a single shot virtually at the same time. The man in the black hat falls to the ground dead. And we cheer the hero, the victor. Unfortunately, in the real Old West, this picture is as far from the truth as a person can get. Seldom, if ever, was a gunfight planned for a certain time of the day or location. It was usually something that took place in the heat of the moment by liquored-up men who felt they were cheated at cards or love, or they were looking for revenge. The low-hanging holsters tied to a leg is an invention of Hollywood. The best-heeled man could have a simple leather holster slipped on a belt. More often than not, the gun was stuck in the waistband or carried in a pocket. Shootouts seldom took place at a distance. Usually it was the climax of an argument. The men were often face to face. One shot? No way. Guns were emptied, sometimes resulting in more bystanders being shot than the participants. Black powder was in use during this time. Waiting until the smoke settled was often what had to happen before the outcome of the shootout could be determined. If the shootout took place at close range, the powder, still burning as it left the gun barrel, could catch a man's clothes on fire. And the fastest man to draw and shoot his pistol the winner? Not according to Wyatt Earp. Wyatt maintained, "The most important lesson I learned was the winner of gunplay usually was the one who took his time. The second was that if I hoped to live on the frontier, I would shun flashy trick shooting as I would poison. I did not know a really proficient gunfighter who had anything but contempt for the gun fanner or the man who literally shot from his hip." There are those who lived up to their reputation. For instance, John Wesley Hardin, Billy the Kid, Wild Bill Hickok, and Ben Thompson were among the deadliest. Among those whose reputation exceeded their performance, Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and Doc Holliday. This CD contains the stories of 16 shootouts, told as history says they took place. They're not necessarily the top 16 shootouts of the Old West. Some of them are well known, like the shootout at the OK Corral. Others are about shootouts that have faded into history. But even though they might not be well known, I can assure you they are interesting and exciting. Now relax and let your imagination go as you are transported back to the Old West. On October 26, 1881, the most famous event of the Old West took place in Tombstone, Arizona. It was the shootout at the OK Corral. More movies have been made about this event than any other single event in the Old West. And true to Hollywood's reputation, they didn't let the facts stand in the way of a good story. It all started in December of 1879 when the Earps arrived in Tombstone with the objective of gaining a fortune. Their interest wasn't to work the mines, but to get a piece of the action that resulted from them. At this time, the cowboys were the political power in Tombstone, and the money was good. For instance, Sheriff Behem was supposedly making about $40,000 a year. That's equivalent to about $700,000 today. The shootout was actually a turf fight between two gangs. The cowboys were the Democrats, rural people, and the establishment. The Earps were the Republicans, city folk, and the newbies. Now, the Earp gang comprised of more than just Wyatt, Morgan, Virgil, and Doc. There were two other Earp brothers, James and Warren. In addition, there was Bat Masterson and Luke Short. Although Luke Short hasn't gotten the press that Wyatt and Bat have, He was every bit the gunman that they were. For a variety of reasons, only 4 members participated in the shootout. James Earp was a bartender in Tombstone who had gotten his fill of shooting in the Civil War. Warren Earp had gotten shot in a ruckus in Mexico and was healing up with his parents in California. Bat Masterson had left to help his brother James in Dodge City. And Luke Short had killed a man in self-defense a few months earlier. And he had left town to prevent one of the man's friends from shooting him in the back. The shootout took place at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. A group of cowboys, headed by the Clantons, who had been a thorn in the side of the Earps, were illegally carrying guns. Virgil Earp was the town marshal. He deputized Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc Holliday to help him take the guns away. Incidentally, prior to this, Wyatt and Morgan were faro dealers. Now, here's where myth starts running amok. First off, the shootout did not take place at the OK Corral. It took place in a vacant lot a block away. The lot was only 15 feet wide with buildings on either side. At the time of the shootout, the vacant lot was packed with 9 men and 2 horses, and the men were only 6 feet apart from each other when the shooting took place. Each of the Earp group probably approached the confrontation with different objectives. Virgil was looking for a peaceful end. He was carrying Doc's cane in his gun hand. Wyatt probably wanted to crack open their heads with his pistol. He had removed it from his holster to his coat pocket. But Doc wanted a shootout, and Morgan, a hothead, probably wanted one also. Oh yes, some movies have the fight going on forever throughout Tombstone. It lasted only 30 seconds. But during those 30 seconds, more than 30 shots were fired. Cowboys Billy Clanton and brothers Frank and Tom McLowry were all killed. Ike Clanton had a slight neck wound. Virgil Earp was shot in the leg. Morgan was shot in the arm. And Doc Holliday had a slight wound in his hip. Wyatt, as was the story throughout his life, came away unscathed. Following the shootout, the tide started turning against the Earps. There was a preliminary hearing. Wyatt and Doc appeared as defendants. Virgil and Morgan were unable to be there because of their injuries. Although there wasn't enough evidence for a trial, Virgil Earp was dismissed as city marshal, and Wyatt was forced to give up his faro game at the Oriental. In December, Virgil, hardly recovered from his OK Corral wound, was ambushed and shot by some cowboys, with the result that he lost the use of his left arm for the rest of his life. And 3 months later, Morgan was shot in the back, again by cowboys, and killed while playing pool. The town of Tombstone was comfortable with the cowboys and their ways, and the Earps' presence was causing trouble with the status quo. So, getting the message, the Earps left town. However, Wyatt came back, and with some of his friends, evened the score with the cowboys. Now, there's a difference of opinion as to how many cowboys he actually killed, but a number of them died at someone's hands. In the Old West, as today, sometimes the looks of a person is deceiving. Tough-looking men are easygoing pussycats, and sometimes a fancy-dressed dude is the tiger on the prowl. In November of 1886, one such tiger on the prowl was elected sheriff of Apache County in the Arizona Territory. Perry Owens was born in Tennessee in 1852. His full name was Commodore Perry Owens. He was never an officer in the Navy. Commodore Perry Owens was named after the great naval hero, Commodore Perry. As a young man, he started migrating west and ended up in the Arizona Territory. He supposedly carried a Sharps 45-60 rifle that was sighted in to be accurate at a mile. For sure, he carried a Winchester rifle and 1 and sometimes 2 pistols. Perry stood about 5'10". He had gray eyes and blonde hair. He wore his hair long, sometimes down to his waist. It wasn't unusual to see him in fancy clothes with fancy chaps and a wide-brimmed hat that always had one of a variety of decorative hat bands. Perry Owens was elected the sheriff of Apache County in the northeastern section of the Arizona Territory on the promise to end rustling and corruption. During this time, the Graham-Tewksbury feud was taking place, which incidentally was the Western equivalent to the Hatfields and McCoys of the South. On September 4, 1887, Perry Owens was pulled into the middle of the Graham-Tewksbury feud. He had a warrant for the arrest of Andy Cooper, a member of the Graham faction. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he arrived in the town of Holbrook, Arizona, looking for Cooper. As Perry, rifle in hand, walked up to the house where Andy was staying, Andy came out with a pistol aimed at Perry. At the same time, Johnny Blevins, a relative of Cooper's, came around the corner of the house. Owens and Cooper fired at the same time. Cooper missed. Perry Owens didn't. A third man, Mose Roberts, Blevins' brother-in-law, appeared at the door and was shot instantly. Johnny Blevins from the corner of the house took a shot at Owens and missed. Perry Owens returned fire, killing Blevins. Johnny Blevins' younger brother then appeared with a pistol. One shot from Perry's rifle did him in. In what was without a doubt one of the most spectacular documented shootouts of the Old West, Perry Owens, in a matter of seconds, killed 3 men and seriously wounded a 4th without receiving a single scratch. From that time forward, the fancy-dressing Perry Owens could have walked down the main street of Holbrook in a woman's dress and sunbonnet, and everyone would have called him Sir. We've all spent an evening out on the town with a friend, and that's the very thing that King Fisher and Ben Thompson did in March of 1884. Only, for these two friends, the evening turned deadly. Although it wasn't a relationship most people would expect, King Fisher and Ben Thompson were friends. Their friendship was unusual because both men were hard cases. Symbolic of King Fisher's attitude was a sign he had over the gate leading into his ranch. "This is King Fisher's road. Take the other one." He dressed in a flamboyant style. He wore a gold-braided sombrero, fringed silk shirts, and gold-embroidered vests. His chaps were made of Bengal tiger skin. He didn't get the tiger from a safari, but a raid on a circus. Fisher traded in cattle. He took cattle that he had stolen in the United States to Mexico and traded them for cattle that had been stolen in Mexico. And the buyers didn't care as long as the cattle didn't have a brand from the country in which they were sold. Much of Fisher's life was filled with arrests for murder and theft, but he was usually found not guilty or was released after the charges were mysteriously dismissed. Cleaning up his act a bit, Fisher was serving as a deputy sheriff and had decided to run for county sheriff. Ben Thompson's reputation wasn't much better. Ben didn't care on which side of the law he walked as long as he could use his pistol and intimidate people. Sensing the opportunity for a good fight, he even went to Mexico and joined Maximilian as a mercenary, rising to the rank of colonel. Ben Thompson, like Fisher, had spent some time as a lawman. He had been the city marshal of Austin, Texas, and he was a good one too, but he resigned after killing Jack Harris, the owner of Harris's Variety Theater in San Antonio. On March 10, 1884, King Fisher was in Austin on official business. He met up with his old friend Ben Thompson, and during the afternoon, the two of them hit a few bars. Fisher was going to take the evening train to San Antonio and then ride his horse the rest of the way home. He persuaded Thompson to accompany him to San Antonio, where they could keep on celebrating. In San Antonio, they continued their drinking. At about 10:30, they went to the Variety Theater. Maybe because of too many drinks or advancing age, Ben Thompson evidently didn't remember that a couple of years earlier, he had killed Jack Harris, the proprietor of that establishment. They had a drink at the bar, and then they went upstairs to watch the variety show. The two friends were joined in the box by 3 men, including Joe Foster, Jack Harris's ex-partner. Words were exchanged, and Thompson pulled his pistol, cocked it, and put it in Joe Foster's mouth. One of the other men grabbed Thompson's pistol. In the meantime, King Fisher started backing away, saying he wanted to leave before trouble started, but it was too late. There were 3 other men in the next box with guns, just waiting for the right moment, and this was it. When the smoke settled, Ben Thompson had 9 slugs in him, and his friend Kingfisher had 13. It was sure a tough night out for the boys. County seats are normally determined by a vote. At least that's the way it was for Gray County, Kansas. The vote was between Cimarron and Ingalls, 2 towns situated 6 miles apart. The winner was Cimarron. But some of the key citizens of Ingalls weren't happy with the outcome, and they took their case to the courts. For over a year, the courts mulled over the situation and did nothing. Finally, Asa Soul from Ingalls decided to take the situation into his own hands. He figured that as the crown or mitre was the authority of a king, the records of a county were the authority of a county seat. So on January 11, 1889, he deputized a group of men with the objective of stealing the county records. The new lawmen weren't novices. They were Dodge City gunmen who included Bill Tillman, Neil Brown, and 2 of Bat Masterson's brothers, Jim and Tom. Just before noon on Saturday, the group, along with a teamster driving a wagon, quietly rode into Cimarron. 4 men, including the 2 Masterson brothers, started carrying out the records as the others stood guard. Unfortunately for them, an alarm was sounded and the men of Cimarron showed up carrying guns. The Ingalls men who were standing guard lit out for shelter, and both groups started exchanging gunfire. In the shootout, the Ingalls group only sustained 1 serious injury, but 3 of the Cimarron men were killed. The Ingalls guards managed to escape, but in the process, the record carriers were caught inside the courthouse. More than 200 men surrounded the courthouse, taking pot shots at anything that moved inside. For more than 24 hours, the men were trapped in the courthouse. Then, mysteriously, a truce was called, and the men were allowed to leave town unscathed. Just what happened here? Well, Bat Masterson heard about his brother's plight, and he sent a telegram to Cimarron stating that if either of his brothers were hurt, he would hire a train and come in with enough men to blow Cimarron off the face of Kansas. In the face of a not-too-veiled threat, the men of Cimarron wisely decided that holding these men accountable for their deeds wasn't really that important. Oh yes, 4 years later, another election was held, and Cimarron again won. It's quite possible that Superman existed back during the 1800s. That is, if we agree that Superman has the ability to dodge bullets and pull off unbelievable feats, then the story I'm about to tell you is about a Superman. In the early 1870s, Mexican banditos were creating havoc in Central California, and most lawmen didn't care to chase them into their hideouts. But Harry Morse wasn't a typical lawman. In 1862, he had been elected sheriff of Alameda County just south of San Francisco. Over the next few years, he regularly tossed outlaws in jail. Then in the spring of 1871, a Mexican bandito named Juan Soto killed 2 people while robbing a general store in Alameda County. On May 10, Harry Morse and Deputy Sam Winchell tracked Soto to a ranch house in Benito County. They rode into the front yard and asked a vaquero working on a corral for a drink of water. The vaquero led them into the house. When they walked into the house, among the group of men inside, Sheriff Morse immediately recognized Juan Soto. Morse pulled his gun and demanded in Spanish that Soto put up his hands. He asked Deputy Winchell to put handcuffs on Soto. The deputy didn't move. So Sheriff Morse told his deputy to cover Soto and he would do the handcuffing. The deputy, feeling the situation was desperate, bolted for the door, leaving Morse alone. Immediately, 2 men on either side of Morse jumped him. In the struggle, Morse's gun went off. Although the bullet didn't hit anyone, it did allow Morse to break loose and run outside toward his horse to get his rifle. But Juan Soto was right behind him with a gun in hand. Morse realized he couldn't make it to the horse, so he turned to face Soto. As Soto pulled off his first shot, Morse dropped to the ground, dodging it. As Morse was getting up, Soto shot again, and again Morse jumped out of the way of the bullet. 4 times Soto shot at close range, and 4 times Morse dodged the bullets. Then Morse was able to get off a shot. The bullet amazingly hit Soto's pistol so he could no longer cock the hammer. Morse then ran to his horse and grabbed his rifle. When he turned back toward Soto, Soto had disappeared into the house. Within a few seconds, the door swung open and 2 men came running out. Immediately, Morse realized, in an effort to confuse the lawmen, the 2 men had exchanged coats. Soto headed for a horse in a nearby corral, but as he tried to climb aboard, the horse spooked. Morse cried out to Soto, "Throw down your pistols! There has been enough shooting!" But the desperado started running for another horse about 250 yards away. Just as Soto reached the horse, Morse aimed and pulled off a shot. The bullet hit Soto in the shoulder. Soto then turned and headed toward Morse with guns blazing. Still over 100 yards away, Morse pulled off another shot. The bullet struck Soto between the eyes. With nerves of steel, the ability to dodge bullets, and a display of superhuman accuracy with a rifle, Harry Morse very well could have been the 1800s alias for Superman. We're all aware of Wild Bill Hickok's expertise with the pistol, and so were the bad guys with whom he faced off. Of all the people Wild Bill shot, the killing of Mike Williams was the one he regretted most. The shooting took place on October 5, 1871. At the time, Wild Bill Hickok was the sheriff of Abilene, Kansas. Now, Abilene was a wild cattle town with a number of ways for cowboys to get into trouble. On this particular night, a group of about 50 drunken Texas cowboys, led by Phil Cole, were causing havoc on the streets. The cowboys were forcing citizens to buy them rounds of drinks. To keep the peace, Wild Bill even bought them a round. But then he warned them that they must keep within the bounds of order or he would stop them. Now, Wild Bill's deputy was Mike Williams. Earlier in the day, Mike had received a telegram that his wife, who was in Kansas City at the time, was sick. Mike immediately bought a ticket on the next train to Kansas City that was to leave at 9:45 in the evening. In the meantime, the Texans kept on creating a ruckus, and about 9 o'clock, Phil Cole fired his pistol, according to Phil, at a dog. Wild Bill told Deputy Williams to stay out of it and get ready to go to Kansas City. Wild Bill then headed for the Alamo Saloon, where he confronted Cole, who still had his pistol in hand. Standing about 8 feet apart, as quick as thought, Wild Bill drew 2 revolvers, and both men fired almost simultaneously. Phil Cole was shot through the stomach. Obviously intending to shoot Cole in the head, Wild Bill mumbled something about shooting too low. Now, one of Cole's shot went through Wild Bill's coat, and another passed between his legs, striking the floor behind him. Unfortunately, 1 or 2 others in the crowd were also hit by the gunfire, but none seriously. At this point, Deputy Mike Williams came around the corner with a gun in hand ready to assist. Wild Bill saw the movement in the corner of his eye, and being surrounded by hostile cowboys, thought he was one of the cowboys. Wild Bill shot Mike Williams twice. This was one time Wild Bill wished he wasn't such a good shot. Wild Bill was seriously affected by the shooting. Quite possibly part of the cause for the mistake could have been his failing eyesight. 2 months later, Wild Bill Hickok was dismissed from his job as Marshal of Abilene. And this was not only the last time he served as a lawman, it was the last time he took a shot at a man. The Dalton brothers Bob, Grat, and Emmett were born in Missouri following the Civil War. Early in life, each of them served a spell as a lawman. Then, evidently seeing that life on the other side of the law paid a lot better, got together in the winter of 1889 and formed an outlaw gang. Their early exploits were in Oklahoma, where they confined their activities to horse stealing and barn looting. Even early on, they weren't the most successful gang that ever existed. In California, they held up a Southern Pacific train. In the process, they killed a brakeman, and they had to leave empty-handed because they were unable to open the safe. With the law in California hot on their heels, the Daltons returned to Oklahoma. While living in the caves around the Cimarron River, they recruited some more guns and men to hold them. With a gang of around 7 men, they went back to robbing trains. In Oklahoma, they were a bit more successful, netting $33,000 in 2 holdups. After a couple of more trains with mixed success, Bob Dalton, the leader, started planning the crime of the century. Bob had always envied the James Gang, and his desire was to become more famous than Jesse James. So Bob decided to, best anything Jesse James ever did, rob 2 banks at once in broad daylight. The town they chose was Coffeyville, Kansas. Now, Coffeyville was a small mercantile town in the southwestern quarter of Kansas. For a western town, it was very civilized. No one wore guns, not even the law. And besides that, Bob was familiar with the town because back in 1882, he had lived there for a spell. It was 9:30 in the morning, Wednesday, October 5, 1891. The 3 Daltons, Dick, Broadwell, and Bill Powers, rode into town. The streets were busy with early morning business. Unfortunately, the hitching rails where they planned on tying their horses had been removed for street repairs. So they tied them in an alley. Wearing false whiskers so the people of Coffeyville wouldn't recognize them, Grat, Broadwell, and Powers went into the Condon Bank. Bob and Emmett took the First National. In spite of their false whiskers, or maybe because of them, they were recognized. The alarm was sounded, and the citizens of Coffeyville started arming themselves from the local hardware stores. Bob and Emmett emerged from the First National with a bag containing $21,000. They were met with a hail of bullets. They retreated back into the bank and out the back door, where a young man was standing with a gun in hand. A slug from Bob's Winchester killed him. Bob then saw 2 local bootmakers who he had known when he was a boy. One of them had a rifle. 2 more shots from his Winchester killed them both. In the meantime, Grat, Powers, and Broadwell were across the street in the Condon Bank. They were falsely told that the safe was on a time lock and it wouldn't open for 3 minutes. With gunfire taking place outside, Grat scooped up $1,500 in loose bills, and the 3 men went to what was later to be named Death Alley, where Bob and Emmett were already with their horses. City Marshal Charles Conley, who had gotten a gun from the hardware store, ran toward the bandits firing the gun. 1 shot from Grat killed him. Now it was the town's turn to inflict casualties. Bob Dalton was shot in the chest, and Grat got one in the neck. As soon as both Powers and Broadwell got on their horses, they were shot out of the saddle. Then Emmett was shot. With no robber standing, the shooting stopped. The whole event took just 15 minutes. During the shootout, 7 townspeople were shot, 4 fatally. Of the bank robbers, Bob and Grat Dalton and Bill Power and Dick Broadwell were all killed. Emmett Dalton was severely shot up but survived. The Dalton Gang no longer existed. Each year, Coffeyville, Kansas remembers the events of October 5, 1892, but they don't celebrate the Dalton Gang. Instead, they honor the residents who gave their lives fighting the Daltons with defenders of Coffeyville days. According to cowboy movies, when it comes time to slap leather, have a shootout for you tenderfeet, the man who was the fastest on the draw was the winner. However, this wasn't normally so. A shootout that took place between gunman Charlie Harrison and Jim Levy was a perfect example. Charlie Harrison was known around town as a person who had a reputation with a gun. Years later, Bat Masterson described Harrison this way: "He could shoot faster and straighter when shooting at a target than any man I ever knew. Then add to that the fact that no man possessed more courage than he did. The natural conclusion would be that he would be a most formidable foe to encounter in a pistol duel." Jim Levy was new to town, but according to one old-timer, he was the top-notcher of them all, except for Wild Bill. It was Friday, March 9, 1877. The location was Cheyenne, Wyoming. After a few drinks, Harrison and Levy decided to play some cards. They sat down at a table in the Shingle and Lock Saloon. After a few hands, an argument ensued. Finally, things got out of control and they started talking about shooting it out. Levy pulled his pistol, but Harrison was unhealed. So in the spirit of fairness, Levy told Harrison to go get a pistol. Harrison then went up to the Senate Saloon and got a gun. As he walked out of the Senate Saloon, Levy was waiting for him across the street. As soon as Harrison got within shooting range, he started firing at Levy. As Harrison approached Levy with bullets flying in the air, Levy calmly pulled his pistol, aimed, and downed his adversary. But Levy wasn't through. He then walked up to Harrison and, while he was on the ground, shot Harrison 2 more times. Harrison died 2 weeks later. Although the locals thought that the 2 additional shots into Harrison while he was on the ground was a bit much, it was understood that in gunfights, the object is not to wound, but to kill. Even though Charlie Harrison was a superb marksman with unquestioned nerve, he paid the penalty for not having deliberation and self-control. Incidentally, years later, both Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp used the shootout between Harrison and Levy as an example of how deliberateness, not speed, was the essential element in a successful gunfight. It was early 1880. The Lincoln County War in New Mexico was all but over. Pat Garrett had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County on the promise that he would bring in Billy the Kid. And within a couple of months after being elected, he made good on his promise. Sheriff Garrett deposited Billy the Kid in jail and left town thinking this would be the last time he would ever see the kid. But it wasn't so. Having a number of possible charges to place against the kid, they settled on the killing of Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady 3 years earlier. He was tried and convicted for the murder of Sheriff Brady. In pronouncing the sentence, Judge Bristol said, "You are sentenced to be hanged by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead." Billy the Kid calmly responded, "And you can go to," 3 times. The hanging was set for May. After being captured, the Kid had written New Mexico's Governor Wallace, reminding him of the promise of a pardon, but they were ignored. It seems that Lew Wallace's attention was elsewhere. His newly published book, Ben-Hur, was a bestseller, and he no longer cared about a minor outlaw. Billy the Kid was in Lincoln, New Mexico, waiting to be hanged. Lincoln didn't have a formal jail, so he was shackled in leg irons and handcuffs, locked in a room on the 2nd floor of the courthouse and placed under guard. One of the men who guarded him was J.W. Bell. J.W. was amiable and easygoing. The other one was Bob Olinger. Bob was the opposite of J.W. Bob often verbally abused the kid, and one time Bob even threatened the kid by shoving his shotgun in the kid's face. The kid told Bob, "There's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip." It was about 6 o'clock the evening of April 28, 1881. Bob Olinger had taken some other prisoners across the street for dinner. Bell was left to guard the kid. The kid had received a note with one word on it, "Privy." Understanding the meaning, the kid said he had to go to the outhouse. Hidden in the outhouse was a pistol. As Bell and the kid were walking up the stairs, the kid slipped a small hand out of one of the cuffs and pulled the pistol. Bell saw what was happening and turned to flee. The kid took a wild shot. It ricocheted off the wall, but luck wasn't on the side of guard Bell, for the bullet then tore through Bell and he died shortly afterward. Next, the kid broke into the armory and got the shotgun that belonged to Bob Olinger. Hearing the shot, Olinger ran out of the restaurant toward the courthouse. It just happened that as Olinger was crossing the street, the kid was standing at the second floor window. The kid yelled down, "Hello, Bob!" Bob looked up and both barrels of the shotgun went off. Bob Olinger died on the spot. Tossing the shotgun next to Bob, the kid shouted, "You won't follow me anymore with that gun." Surprisingly, the kid wasn't in a hurry to leave Lincoln. He asked an acquaintance to find him a horse. For an hour he tried getting the shackles off his legs with a prospector's pick. Only getting one shackle loose, he tied the loose chain around his other leg, calmly got on a horse and rode out of town, stating that he would send the pony back. Sure enough, the next day the pony wandered back into town. The kid could easily kill men, but he couldn't steal a man's horse. It was a pocket watch that saved the life of one of the participants of the Luke Courtright shootout. You may think you know what happened, but you could be wrong. It was 1887. Timothy Isaiah Courtright, known as Long-Hair Jim, owned a detective agency in Fort Worth, Texas. Now, Jim had a reputation of walking on both sides of the law. Back in 1876, he had spent 3 years as a city marshal of Fort Worth. Later, he killed a couple of squatters in New Mexico. Jim returned to Fort Worth and opened the TIC Commercial Detective Agency. But before he could get his business going, extradition papers from New Mexico were served on him. Jim was able to escape on the way back to New Mexico. After wandering around a bit, he decided to return to New Mexico and face the music, which he did. And the music was sweet. Jim was cleared of all charges. With his legal problems solved, Jim returned to Fort Worth to continue his detective agency. Now, the primary job of his agency was to police the gambling joints in return for a piece of the action. Today, that service is called a protection racket. Things went well for Jim until Luke Short bought a 1/3 share in Jake Johnson's White Elephant Saloon. Although Luke was short, only 5'4", he was not one to be trifled with. Over the years, he had associated with the likes of Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and dozens of other hard cases. Although Jake Johnson had been paying Courtright protection money, when Short became a partner, not one to be pushed around, he refused to pay. Courtright sent a threat to Short through Short's partner Jake Johnson. On February 8, Short confronted Courtright at a shooting gallery. Standing belly button to belly button, they were having a heated discussion when Short started to reach inside his coat. Courtright told Short not to go for his gun. Short responded that he didn't carry his gun there, but Courtright was already pulling his pistol. Courtright cocked the hammer and squeezed the trigger. They were standing so close that the hammer of Courtright's gun got stuck in Luke Short's pocket watch chain, and the gun wouldn't fire. By now, Short had drawn his gun, and he proceeded to empty it. Courtright was hit in the thumb, right shoulder, and heart. Within minutes, long-haired Jim Courtright was dead. the result of one of the strangest flukes in Old West gunfights. Incidentally, Luke Short had sold out his share of the White Elephant the day before. Gunfights in the Old West were usually caused by one of three reasons: women, gambling, or revenge. And as we shall see with one of Dodge City's most famous gunfights, it was over a woman. One of the participants was Levi Richardson. Richardson was born in Wisconsin in 1851. As a young man, he came out west and did some buffalo hunting. But because of the lack of buffalo, Richardson had to give up that nasty profession to become a freighter. He was a well-liked, hard-working individual. Richardson was known for his proficiency with both a pistol and a rifle. Even though most people knew him as an easygoing person, he was also known to have a quick temper if riled. The other participant was Frank Loving. Frank was a drifter and ex-cowboy who worked at making a living as a professional gambler. He was also known as Cockeyed Frank because his eyes tended to look toward each other. Loving, unlike Richardson, was known to be cool with a steady nerve. The year was 1879, the location Dodge City, Kansas, at its heyday. Both Loving and Richardson had been spending some time in Dodge. Now comes the catalyst. It seems that Levi Richardson had fallen in love with a young woman. Unfortunately for him, she loved another. And that person was none other than Cockeyed Frank Loving. Although they weren't married, Loving and the young lass were cohabitating. It was 8 o'clock Saturday evening, April 5. The activities of the Babylon of the Plains, as Dodge City was known at the time, were just warming up. The evening was cool. Aboard Levi Richardson, taking a break from the spell at the bar, was warming himself at the potbelly stove in the Long Branch Saloon. Deciding there had to be more excitement at one of the other saloons, Richardson started to leave. But as he was heading for the door, Frank Loving entered the saloon. Paying no attention to Richardson, Loving went over to the gambling tables and took a seat. With drinks under his belt, lust in his heart for a Loving's woman, and then seeing him strut in like the cock of the walk was just more than Richardson could handle. So he followed Loving to the gambling table and sat down next to him. Tired of Richardson sulking around, Loving jumped up and said, "You SOB, if you have anything to say about me, why don't you say it to my face like a gentleman?" "You wouldn't fight if I did," responded Richardson. "Just try me and see," challenged Loving. With both men still standing face to face, Richardson went for his gun. He pulled off a shot before Loving was able to draw his pistol. It went wild. By now, Loving had his pistol out and cocked. He pulled the trigger. The hammer dropped, but nothing happened. It was a misfire. Seeking cover, Loving ran behind the potbelly stove that Richardson had been using earlier to warm himself. With everyone else in the Long Branch running for cover, Richardson was right behind Loving, taking 2 more shots. They also missed their mark. Fortunately for Loving, after that first misfire, his gun performed flawlessly. Unlike Richardson, who was just filling the air with lead, using cool deliberation, Loving proceeded to shoot Richardson in the chest, side, and arm. He died on the spot. Loving, on the other hand, suffered only a scratch on the hand. After the smoke settled, both guns were checked. In the fracas, both men had emptied them. Counting the misfire, 11 shots had been fired, 3 of which had ended up in Richardson. 8 shots had missed their mark. The amazing thing about the gunfight was that with lead flying everywhere in a crowded room, no bystander was hit. As we shall see with the story of the Cahill-Linn shootout, one of the codes of the Old West came into effect. That was that a man must kill his own snakes. or that a man had to handle his own problems even though the odds were against him. It was April 14, 1884. The location was a Texas border town, El Paso. Bill Raynard and Buck Linn, two ruffians, were on the town enjoying a few drinks. Raynard was known as the best-dressed bad man in Texas. His buddy Linn was a nice enough guy except when he was drunk, and on this night he was drinking heavily. Wandering from tavern to tavern, hassling customers and employees, Buck Linn got into an argument with a faro dealer at the gym saloon by the name of Bob Cahill. Shortly afterward, the two men separated in order to follow up on separate pleasures. Still in the gym saloon, Raynard started taunting a stranger at the bar. But when the man told him he was unarmed, Raynard moved on to someone else. Now, the stranger was actually a hard case by the name of Cowboy Bob Rennick. The more Cowboy Bob thought about the incident, the madder he got. So he got a pistol. Raynard saw what was happening and came after Cowboy Bob with his gun blazing. 2 shots from Cowboy Bob's borrowed gun, and Rennick was on the floor dying. Bystanders told Cowboy Bob that he had better get out of town, and he did. Meanwhile, word got back to Buck Linn that his buddy was killed. Because his buddy Raynard had gotten into a row with Bob Cahill earlier in the evening, Linn thought that he had done the killing. Now, Bob Cahill was not a gunman. He didn't even carry a gun. Word came to Cahill that Linn was on his way to kill him, and there was no way of reasoning with him. Although Cahill was with his friend Dan Tipton, a man who knew how to handle a gun, and Wyatt Earp was there also, Cahill knew he had to handle the situation himself. Friend Tipton gave Cahill his .45 Colt, but the best help came from Wyatt Earp. Wyatt said, "Have your gun cocked, but don't pull until you're certain of what you're shooting at. Aim for his belly low. The gun will throw up a bit, but if you hold it tight and wait until he's close enough, you can't miss. Keep cool and take your time." A nervous Bob Cahill didn't have long to wait, for in a short time footsteps were heard, and the door of the gambling hall flew open, and in came Buck Linn with gun in hand. Immediately, Linn pulled off 4 poorly aimed shots. Taking his time, Cahill aimed and pulled the trigger. Cahill's shot hit Linn in the heart, killing him instantly. Cahill had killed his own snake. Incidentally, this shootout once again proved that the man who pulled the trigger first wasn't always the winner. The Masterson brothers, Edward, James, and Bat, were close. They hunted buffalo together and at various times served as lawmen. But it seems as if it wasn't all that unusual for one of Bat's brothers to get into trouble, and although he wasn't the oldest sibling, Bat would willingly come to the aid of either Edward or James. In this story, helping out a brother not only got Bat into one gunfight, it got him out of another. From 1879 to 1881, James Masterson, Bat's younger brother, was the Marshal of Dodge City. However, on April 6, 1881, because of a change in city government, James was dismissed. However, this wasn't James's only income. He owned a piece of the Lady Gay Saloon. His partner was an A.J. Peacock. Now, theirs wasn't the most cordial partnership. Peacock had hired his brother-in-law Al Updegraff as bartender, and James felt that Updegraff was skimming off some of the profits. Obviously, he didn't like it. The evening of April 9, the dislike turned to gunshots between James, Peacock, and Updegraff. Although the fight was broken up and no shots hit their mark, the damage was done. Like many a schoolyard squabble, I'm sure James probably said something like, "I'm going to tell my brother and he'll beat you up," because right after the incident, James telegraphed his brother Bat, who was in Tombstone, Arizona at the time. Bat immediately jumped on a train and traveled the 1,100 miles to Dodge City to help out his brother. Peacock obviously knew that Bat was coming because when Bat stepped off the train, Peacock and Updegraff were the first people he saw. Bat, not one to put off the inevitable, walked in the direction of Hickok and up to Graff and shouted, "I have come over 1,000 miles to settle this. I know you're healed. Now fight." Guns were drawn. The three men dove for cover and bullets started flying. Soon more gunshots were heard from another direction as some of Hickok's friends entered the fray. And then more shots as James Masterson joined in. One bullet hit the ground just in front of Bat, kicking dirt in his face, and then ricocheting off, hitting a bystander in the back. Another bullet, quite possibly from Bat's pistol, hit up to Graff in the lung. After about 3 minutes, there was a break in the shooting. As the shootout participants were reloading their guns, the mayor and the sheriff took advantage of this break and showed up with loaded shotguns demanding the shootout stop, which it did. Fortunately, both the innocent bystander and up to Graff recovered from their bullet wounds. The outcome of the event? Bat Masterson, the outsider, was arrested and charged with discharging a pistol upon the streets of the city. He pleaded guilty and was fined $8 in costs. Bat paid the fine, and the two Mastersons wisely left town on the next train. Oh yes, earlier I said that Bat Masterson avoided one gunfight to come to Dodge City to help his brother in another gunfight. The gunfight Bat probably missed out on was the shootout at the OK Corral. You see, at the time he received the telegram from his brother, Bat Masterson was in Tombstone with close friend Wyatt Earp. And if he had stuck around Tombstone, he very well could have been standing next to the Earps and Doc Holliday 6 months later, assisting them in their shootout. Earlier I said that shootouts usually took place during the heat of the moment. The shootout I'm about to describe seemed to be cold and calculated. When I'm done, I think you'll agree. Clay Allison was the type of man who evoked legends. Most historians agree that he was a psychopath. At the height of the Civil War, when the Confederate Army was drafting into service anyone who could hold a rifle, Clay Allison was released on a medical discharge, stating that he was maniacal. Ending up in Cimarron, New Mexico in 1870, Clay and some other local citizens broke a man out of jail and lynched him in the local slaughterhouse. But Clay wasn't satisfied, and seeing the tools of the trade laying around, cut the man's head off, stuck it on a pole, and gave it to the local saloon owner to display in his establishment. In 1875, Clay became involved in another lynching. This time the man was hanged from a telegraph pole. Since there was no butcher equipment around, Clay merely dallied the end of the rope around his saddle horn and dragged the corpse around town. A lot of Clay Allison's strange actions could be credited to his fondness for strong drink. It seems that when Clay was under the influence, he was inclined to take off his clothes, jump on his horse, and Lady Godiva around town, and then invite everyone into the nearest saloon for a round of drinks. Such a party animal. The other participant in the shootout was a man named Chunk Colbert. Although little is known of Chunk, he was reputed to have killed 7 men. There are records of his participating in 2 shootouts, not counting this one. The date was January 7, 1874. The location was Cimarron, New Mexico, situated a few miles from the Colorado border. A few years earlier, Allison supposedly had been in a fight with one of Colbert's relatives. It's thought that Colbert showed up to seek revenge. Now, there were few cowboys who didn't think their horse was the best and fastest around. Evidently, that's what both Allison and Colbert thought, because they decided to settle their differences with a horse race. Like most towns of that time, Cimarron had a quarter-mile racetrack. Some historians say Colbert won. Others say it was a dead heat. But whichever it was, Colbert, in the spirit of graciousness, invited Allison to join him for supper at Stockton's Clifton House, an inn and store across the street from the track. Allison accepted. Over the next 2 hours, the two men had a leisurely meal. While finishing up the meal, Colbert, with a cup of coffee in his left hand, started pulling his pistol under the table with his right. Realizing what was happening, Allison also drew his pistol. Colbert fired first, but it was in haste and hit the table, not Allison. Allison then shot Colbert above the right eye. With Colbert bent forward, his face in a bowl of soup, Allison calmly righted his chair and finished his meal. When asked why he had a meal with a man who had come to town with the purpose of killing him, Clay Allison calmly said, "I don't want to send a man to hell on an empty stomach." The Lincoln County War in New Mexico had a number of battles. The Blazers Mill Shootout was one of those battles. And as you shall see, the 13 regulators who participated in the shootout were on the short end of the stick, and they were only fighting one guy. It was April 4, 1878. Less than 2 months earlier, the Lincoln County War had broken out with the killing of John Tunstall. Billy the Kid and a number of other men had formed a quasi-legal posse called the Regulators. On this day, the Regulators, numbering 13, had ridden into Blazers Mill to have dinner. They left John Middleton outside as a lookout. In the meantime, unaware that the Regulators were in the area, Buckshot Roberts, a minor member of the posse that killed Tunstall, rode into town. Lookout Middleton saw Buckshot tie up his horse about a block away. He went inside and told the others about Buckshot's arrival. Regulator Frank Cole, a friend and neighbor of Buckshot's, said he would go out and see if he could talk Buckshot into surrendering. Buckshot was carrying a rifle when he and Cole met. With the rifle across his lap, Buckshot and Cole sat down and started talking. As the conversation between the two continued, the Regulators became concerned that Buckshot was holding Cole hostage. The Regulator leader, Richard Brewer, decided the negotiations were over. It was time to take Buckshot. As the Regulators approached the two men, they commanded Buckshot to surrender. He responded by firing off a shot. The shot hit Regulator Brewer's belt buckle, ricocheted off, mangling another Regulator's hand. Brewer returned fire, hitting Buckshot. Staggering backwards, Buckshot continued firing his rifle, hitting Lookout Middleton in the chest and grazing the arm of Billy the Kid. As the Regulators scrambled for cover, Buckshot retreated into a building. Seeing Brewer, the leader of the Regulators, peeking over a barrier, Buckshot took careful aim and shot him in the head, killing Brewer instantly. With 3 men shot and their leader dead, the Regulators wisely retreated to fight another day. Just why would one man choose not to surrender and to take on 13 men instead? Well, he had told his friend Frank Cole that he was afraid that if he surrendered, Billy the Kid would shoot him on sight. John Wesley Hardin was born in Texas in 1853. He was the son of a Methodist minister who named him after the founder of the Methodist Church, John Wesley. A square-jawed young man of slight build, Wes first showed his penchant for violence at the age of 14 when he stabbed a classmate for teasing him. Spurred by the hatred for the freed blacks, a year later he killed a black man. 3 troopers were sent after him. They were dispatched by Wes. While on the run, Wes got crossways with a gambler. With 2 bullets in him, the gambler pleaded for mercy. Wes responded with 4 more shots. During the next year and a half, Wes killed 4 police officers, an Indian, and 6 Mexicans. Arriving in Abilene, Kansas when Wild Bill Hickok was marshal, Wes and Wild Bill became friendly. Each knowing the other's skill with a gun and inclination to kill, they probably agreed with the saying, "Keep your friends close and your enemies even closer." Things went well until one night when Wes Hardin was awakened by a man snoring in the next room. Wes picked up his pistol and fired 2 shots into the wall. After the second shot, the man never snored again. Realizing Wild Bill would come after him, Wes exited through the window in his nightshirt, never to return to Abilene. Wes was able to stay out of the hands of the law until the night of his 21st birthday, when he killed Deputy Charles Webb. Since there was some question about it being self-defense, Wes received a 25-year sentence instead of being hanged. While in jail, Wes studied law. After 15 years, the governor pardoned him. In 1894, Wes became a fully qualified lawyer and hung out his shingle in El Paso, Texas. He was hired by an attractive woman named Mrs. Martin McRose to defend her husband, a criminal in hiding. While Mrs. McRose and Wes were spending a lot of time together developing her husband's defense strategy, things started developing between the two of them. Unfortunately for Martin McRose, he was shot before he could turn himself in, but by then, neither his wife nor Wes seemed to care. One time when Wes Hardin was out of town, his new roommate, the former Mrs. Martin McRose, got drunk and was arrested and fined by policeman John Selman Jr. When Wes returned, he was furious that anyone would trifle with his woman. Wes encountered John Selman Sr. on an El Paso street. Wes told John Sr. that his son was an SOB. Now, although John Sr. was about 60 years of age, some 20 years older than Wes, as a lawman, John Sr. had dispatched about 20 men himself. John Sr. didn't immediately react to Wes's remarks about his son, but he spent the afternoon and evening thinking about what Wes had said, and the more he thought, the madder he got. In the meantime, Wes Hardin was visiting the Acme Saloon drinking. A little after 11 o'clock in the evening, the doors of the Acme Saloon swung open. John Sr. was standing there with gun in his hand. Quite possibly, Wes saw John in the bar mirror because witnesses say he started to turn, drawing his gun. But obviously, John's first bullet moved faster than Wes because it entered the back of his head. John Sr. then walked up to Wes and shot him twice more for insurance. John Sr. then surrendered to his son. He was tried and found innocent. A thank you from the local citizens for getting rid of a nuisance. This is Dakota Livesay. If you've enjoyed the stories of the Old West shootouts, you'll love the CDs we have in the works. Our plan is to provide Old West enthusiasts with a CD each quarter. Like this one, it will be a series of stories on a single subject. Future topics will include lawmen of the Old West, women of the Old West, inventions and discoveries of the Old West, the really bad men, minorities in the Old West, the not-so-famous, con artists, and Wild West towns. If you would like to be assured of your copy before the CD even hits the market, visit our website, chronicleoftheoldwest.com, or call us at 866-OLD-PRESS and get your subscription. Now, always remember, the Old West is a time and place of the heart.